and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 17th of October and welcome to the Full Scottish. I'm sorry we're starting a little late this morning. Travel from east to west across the central belt of the country is not straightforward this morning. I hope nobody's been seriously injured in the accident that closed the M8. I'm Andrew Wilson, and today I'm lucky enough to be hosting the programme from our studios in Cowcaddens. First, we will have today's coronavirus update, and then I'll introduce our two guests for this afternoon, and then together we will look at the news headlines from the past week together. As at 2 p.m. yesterday, there were 2,581 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. There were also 21 reported new deaths of people who had tested positive. 4,282,132 people have received their first doses of the COVID vaccination, and 3,875,966 have received their second dose. 841 people were confirmed in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 47 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 605,104 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID-19, and in that time, 8,928 patients who have tested positive in the UK have sadly died. Now, this afternoon, we're joined by two outstanding guests in the north of the country. Firstly, we're joined by Fiona Grahame. Fiona is a freelance journalist and editor of the Orkney News, which is a not-for-profit community online media site. Living and working in Orkney, Fiona has a passion for researching its local history and how it relates to the wider world. Fiona, good morning. How are you? Good afternoon. How are you?
Afternoon there. It's a beautiful day in Orkney.
That's fantastic. Thank you for joining us, and a public apology again for my tardiness in turning up this afternoon. And we're also joined this afternoon by Kenny Anderson. Kenny was the managing director of Anderson Buchan is the managing director of Anderson Buchan Properties, and he was the managing director of Anderson Construction Aberdeen. He's a past chair of the Chartered Institute of Building Scotland, and is also chair of Clan Cancer, which provides support for anyone affected by cancer from diagnosis onwards across Aberdeenshire, Moray, Orkney, Shetland, and operates a purpose-built Clan Haven in Aberdeen. Kenny, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm very well, yes. Thank you very much. I should say that I've since relinquished my role as chairman, passing the baton on to ensure good governance at Clans. So, but I enjoyed my time very much and hopefully helped many people.
Thanks, Kenny. Thanks for that clarification. Our first news story, and the news story that has dominated the papers and the headlines since the story broke on Friday afternoon, was the attack and murder of the MP, Sir David Amess, and his attack in the course of his holding a regular surgery with constituents in Leon C. The investigation into the events is still ongoing, and it's a live criminal investigation, so there's not a great deal that can usefully be discussed about the specifics of the attack and the murder of the MP. However, it has also reignited the debate with regard to the safety and security of MPs and other elected officials, the way in which MPs and other elected officials are treated and treat each other, and also what I heard the Home Secretary describe, somewhat unusually, the Home Secretary described as the coarsening of political debate. And so I'd like to talk to both Kenny and Fiona this morning about the broader issues which this terrible attack and murder have highlighted again. When discussing the story during the week, of course, we've made reference to the murder of the Batley and Spen MP, Joe Cox, immediately before the Brexit referendum. And I think that means there have been two MPs attacked and killed in 5 years. And we know that MPs have also been attacked, and not fatally attacked, but have been attacked in their surgeries and in their constituency offices from time over the past. I'm also reminded in the context of the nature and the way in which politics are debated at the moment, that it would be, I think, not unreasonable to say that there has been a coarsening of the debate. We know the ways, we all see and hear the ways in which the First Minister is addressed and is referred to, including by members of the Yes movement. And we also saw, before the end of the last Scottish Parliament, the way in which MPs from time to time address each other. I'm reminded in particular of Alex Cole-Hamilton during a committee swearing online at Marie Todd. And so I think there is evidence and there are circumstances of the way in which the level of debate has coarsened. And following up on the death of Sir David Amess, Ian Blackford said, "In recent years we have seen increasingly unacceptable levels of abuse and intimidation aimed at MPs. At its worst, this has resulted in violent attacks and the murder of Joe Cox and now Sir David Amess. All of us are united in sadness today and in calling for an end to this abuse, intimidation and violence. It is a threat to our democracy and it has to stop." So Fiona, turning to you first, I alluded to the way in which the First Minister is referred to from time to time and the levels of abuse and threats that she and other female MPs and MSPs receive. Do you think that as part of the approach and the reckoning that we're seeing just now with regard to the behaviour of men towards women generally, do you think that in the context of politics we need to push as hard, if not harder, to end the way in which the abuse and the attacks and the threats that our female elected representatives are receiving at the moment?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say that I think it's appalling when anybody is attacked and killed, in the course of their work. And deepest sympathies go out to the families of all those involved. Of course, violence against women has also been in the news recently, and there's nothing new in that, I'm afraid to say, and it's very difficult to find a woman that hasn't had to be very careful when out walking at night or anything like that, and why we should have to employ different means to keep ourselves safe is an indictment of our society and how violent it still is. As regards political discourse, I think it's always been, sharp. Certainly on social media, people seem to think they can get away with saying anything. And I think there's a complete decline in the ability to discuss and debate things in a reasonable manner, because we should be able to discuss with our political opponents, if you like to use that term, without slagging them off. Let's concentrate on the issues. And it's people who are in the public, like politicians, they have a role, they have a really important role to play, as does the media, in how they present themselves and opinions.
Thanks, Fiona. And Kenny, I was wondering if you'd been thinking. I was certainly reflecting on the challenge that we will probably face with regard to the balancing between the safety and security of elected officials at all levels, on the one hand, and the openness and the approachability and the transparency, that the ability to interact one-to-one with all MPs and MSPs is important. I'm reminded that certainly in the last few occasions I've been at events where the First Minister has been speaking, there is security for her, but the security is pretty low key. Certainly for party political events, it'll be a couple of close protection officers who are not uniformed and are not particularly visible. So it's clear that struck me as being an indication that the balance was very important to be maintained between accessibility and security. So Kenny, do you have any reflection on whether we need to change that balance between allowing members of the public to speak to politicians face to face in the street and in surgeries, and on the other hand, protecting them against the risk of attack?
Well, firstly, yes. I mean, the sympathies go to the family of David Amos, and it was interesting to listen to the reflections of Joe Cox's sister in these matters. And of course, many politicians are being threatened on a daily basis, whether it's on social media or more openly, including Scottish politicians. And I think there has to be maintained a balance. Of course, somebody who perhaps is going to a MSP or MP surgery is perhaps agitated and worked up and nervous even before they get there. So it must be very hard to judge whether there is any threat. I mean, I'm no defender of Jacob Rees-Mogg. He was confronted in a Manchester street by a very genuine person who was quite agitated and who had disabilities. And the chap was very articulate, but initially it must have seemed to protection officers or colleagues that there was a threat. And yet that gentleman went on to very eloquently put his case to Jacob Rees-Mogg, who in fairness responded politely and calmly and took time. And far be it from me to defend any Conservative, but I do defend the right of our elected politicians, our candidates, and really anybody, particularly vulnerable people, women, to go about life without the threat of violence or attack. And there has been a deterioration, no question at all, and there's a polarisation which isn't healthy. And I think it's important for people to genuinely have discourse with people who have got opposing views, and to listen politely and to take on board and maybe even reflect on other people's views, because they might change in some way part of your views. And that seems to be happening less and less. I thought of armed officers at political surgeries or at constituency events or even community events where a politician might be present. Seems very, very sad, but and I'm no expert in security, but I would imagine what the First Minister receives is probably going to be something that will have to be rolled out for other elected members. And I know that a number of Scottish politicians that I know have had threats. So I think it's got to be widely condemned and see what can be done to improve matters.
Thanks, Kenny. Yes, the point about armed officers is well made, and it certainly I can recall when Police Scotland was established and the rules and the policies round about armed police being on the streets changed, and the way in which the community pushed back strongly against that, challenging that it was the appropriateness of having armed officers routinely patrolling at public events, and so I think it may be the case that there's still an element of the public wish to maintain some openness and without the kind of heavy-handed policing and security that we're frankly not used to in Scotland, in order to allow that balance to continue. But I'm sure that as the circumstances of this most recent outrage become clearer, I'm sure we will return to this story and discuss it further, both the specifics of the murder but also the more general points with regard to the tone of political debate in the UK and our wider community again. But we'll move on now to the second item for today, which also in a sense is related to the level of debate and questions of security and transparency. And that was, we were keen to discuss this morning. It's the 4th anniversary of the murder of the Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. And now, Ms. Galizia was a brilliant journalist who unearthed countless scandals. She took no prisoners, ruthlessly demanding that those involved in corruption be held to account, as well as her weekly column in the Malta Independent and her role as editor of Taste and Flair magazine. Her blog, Running Commentary, was one of the most visited sites in Malta. On peak days, its readership could surpass 400,000 viewers at a time when Malta's population was about 467,000. But of course, as we know, her work and her tenacity made her a target. And in the context of the 4th anniversary of the murder of Daphne Galizia, and also in the context of the recent award of the Nobel Peace Prize to two journalists who have spent their time holding the very powerful in their own communities to account and seeking to uncover corruption and criminality wherever possible. Fiona, I was going to come to you first, if I may. Daphne Galizia was famous for holding power to account and famously paid for it with her life. In terms of the way in which the balance between openness and safety and the importance of the fourth estate of campaigning journalists to our democracies. What lessons or what reflections do you have on the murder of Daphne Galizia and the events that have unfolded in those 4 years since she was killed?
Well, if you'll recall, back in 2019, Lyra McKee was killed in Ireland. In 2018, Jan Kuciak, he was killed in Slovakia, murdered in his bed with his fiancée. He was investigating money laundering there, and such was the outrage in Slovakia that the people took to the streets, and that led to the fall of that government. We published a series at the beginning of last year in the Orkney News of journalists who, throughout newspaper history, if you like, had been instrumental in making changes, and some had paid with their lives, some had been imprisoned. Partly that was to mark those incredible people, but also because we were kind of fed up seeing the comments on social media that all journalists are rubbish, and don't bother with newspapers or media and all the rest of it. And that's a very, very dangerous view to allow to just collect itself and gather momentum. So we published this series, and it goes right back, if you think of James Rowe, and who produced the Manchester Observer, and he was at the Peterloo Massacre. In fact, he's the guy that coined that phrase, Peterloo Massacre. And there were lots of journalists at that dreadful event where lots of people were killed. But what he did was he publicised it, as did the other journalists. And of course, the establishment tried to suppress what they were doing. Now, the story for James Rowe doesn't end out great. I mean, he ended up a bookseller because he just couldn't get his newspaper going much further, and he ended up in quite poor circumstances, and that's what happens to a lot of people. But we must remember that there's a lot of really, really good journalists out there, and it's important that they do hold politicians and people with power to account, and that they're allowed to do so. And so I challenge whenever I can, when I see comments on social media that just say all journalists are rubbish or something and we can do without them, because we certainly cannot.
Thank you, Fiona. Kenny, the point that Fiona makes is a good one, and it relates to the first story we were discussing before, again, about the nature of public debate and the nature of public interaction. And certainly I would be the first to admit to expressing strong views on the activities of some journalists, partially because of the ever closening, ever narrowing gap between journalists and politicians, and also growing concerns, in particularly in the United Kingdom, that there is no distinction between sections of the media and the political parties. And so is it the case that we're now, or I'll take the blame, we're not able to distinguish between journalists who are still doing the traditional job of journalists of investigating and uncovering and reporting, and journalists who are now courtiers to political parties and are simply extensions of those political parties and politicians' press offices?
Well, I mean, I think as with politics in general, there's been a polarisation again, an entrenchment of positions. I mean, during 2014, during the independence debates, I came across very many mainstream journalists from all the main TV channels, a lot of the newspapers, and to be honest, some journalists who are vilified by independence supporters, I found to be very fair and very balanced. Not all of them, in my opinion, but many of them were, and were genuinely wanting to get to the nub of the issue. I mean, I won't name names, but some of them have now moved on from being mainstream broadcasters and are very interested in the ongoing debates. I mean, through history, journalists and others are attacked. Veronica Guerin in Dublin was attacked, we believe, by drug overlords, and she was very active in uncovering unsavoury information about powerful people. I mean, I think we have to consider how we treat journalists, what's been said already about calling out perhaps a generalisation of attacking journalists. I mean, obviously some newspapers and some new television channels are particularly provocative in an unacceptable way, in my opinion. But in general terms, I think we have to listen, be influenced, and counter what we consider to be unreasonable language. But again, as with politicians, it's not about their appearance, it's not about their personalities, it's about the issues. And I think the discourse has got to be considered. And I mean, if you Google attacks on journalists, there's just screeds and screeds of pages from anywhere from the Philippines to countries that you consider liberal, like Sweden, obviously the UK and other places. And through history, extremism has flourished where journalists have been stifled. So I think our fourth estate are very important to us.
Thanks, Kenny. And it's an interesting point that you make. I was reading during the week about it's a hobby horse of mine is effective communication, and as so happened, I was reading a brief article, and one of the first points it made was that one of the fundamentals of effective communication is listening, not broadcasting. And so, do you think? And if social media is a sort of broadcasting, a broadcasting of people's personal brands and extensions of themselves, and it is an ability to communicate apparently freely with the world. Do you think that the growth of the use of social media to broadcast, if you will, has at the same time reduced people's ability to listen, and thereby the process of communication has deteriorated and been polarised?
Yes, and I mean, I don't think, I'm not sure about the ins and outs of it, but I'm not sure about anonymity, particularly in places like Twitter, that allows people to do and say and make threatening comments in very many ways. And there's an entrenchment. I mean, I commented negatively on something a couple of weeks ago that I felt that the Scottish Government hadn't handled particularly well. Well, there was an onslaught to the extent that some people were suggesting that I was of a completely different political hue. So one of them, I suggested that he looked at my tweets and comments and retweets and replies from 2012 before he made that judgment. He kindly came back and apologised, and but that's the other part of it. You know, you can't stifle genuine criticism, and if it's friend on friend criticism, then it's all the more valid. But there is an entrenchment. The anonymity doesn't help, and you know, when you get large groups of people who are perhaps of a particular political hue or they support a particular football team, you sometimes get a pile-on that is horrendous and not healthy.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kenny. We'll move on from discussing the challenges of social media now. And our next story is that confidential documents leaked to The Observer reveal an extraordinary rift between Boris Johnson and his Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, over the potential economic effects of moving towards a zero carbon economy, with just weeks to go before COP26 in Glasgow. As Johnson prepares to position the UK apparently at the head of global efforts to combat climate change and to curb greenhouse gas emissions, as technically the host of COP26 in Glasgow, the documents show that the Treasury is warning of serious economic damage to the UK economy and future tax rises if the UK overspends on or misdirects green investment. Green experts have said that the half-baked and one-sided Treasury net zero review presented only the costs of action on emissions rather than the benefits such as green jobs, lower energy bills and avoiding the disastrous impact of global heating. They said the review could be weaponised by climate change deniers around the world before COP26, undermining Johnson's attempts at climate leadership on the global stage. So Fiona, for you first, do you think that this story appearing at this time, so soon before, so close to COP26 in Glasgow, do you think it is properly a reflection of policy debate in the Westminster government, or is it simply jockeying for political position and Rishi Sunak trying to talk to a particular base of Conservative supporters who are self-admitted climate change deniers?
I'm sorry, I found that phrase Boris as a climate leader quite funny. Any kind of leadership from him, you know, just that was yeah. Never mind. Well, what we're talking about really is this is a climate emergency. The clue's in the word emergency. We do need to do stuff now. I'm concerned that Scotland, we're exporters of energy, and particularly here in Orkney, we have 120% we produce of renewables, mostly by wind, and yet we have the highest rate of fuel poverty. So there's a complete mismatch there, and you know, the Scottish government does do things to try and invest in, you know, warmer homes, electricity vouchers for people, a whole remit of stuff to try and help. But power rests with the UK government with energy, and you know, they've taken the oil, and they're still taking it, and now they're looking to wind and the green energy bonanza that's there, and particularly in the north, and I'm referring to the Highlands and Islands there, where we produce the green energy, but we don't see any of the benefits of it. So I really think there's a incredibly serious inequality built in already to our energy system, and what's going forward at the moment from the UK government is not going to reduce that in any way.
Thanks, Fiona. And Kenny, we've touched a little on the politics of this, and indeed it sounds there's potentially even more politics going on. As Fiona says, one might expect the current Prime Minister to do or say whatever it is that he thinks is the right thing to say at that precise moment in time, and that will have no bearing on anything that he has said before or he'll say again in the future. But we seem to have a conflict again here between the Treasury and the Business Department in Westminster. The Treasury attempting to damp down or one of the risks associated with green investment, and taking steps to address the climate emergency. Whereas at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Kwasi Kwarteng's department, they view that the Treasury is kicking back against many of the green plans being advanced by Number 10 and Kwasi Kwarteng, and are attacking the Treasury, saying they're not climate change deniers, but all they do is emphasise the short-term risks rather than the long-term needs, which is what we need to be emphasising. So thinking, Kenny, you're in the North East, thinking of, we have seen politics in general, but in terms of energy policy and development policy, short-term thinking and short-term steps being taken in the context of the oil industry from time to time. And do you think with the growth that, as Fiona was saying, of renewable power generation and creation in Scotland in particular, do you think we're seeing this is a reflection, this story is a reflection of an old way of doing things, which may in fact threaten our response to the climate change emergency, because politicians necessarily think only in the very short term, no more than 5 years at a time, whereas what's necessary here, both in terms of green energy, but also in terms of the decarbonisation of the oil industry, that what we need to do, as Fiona says, is act quickly, but to act quickly with a long-term plan.
Yeah, I mean, as Fiona says, the inarticulate Prime Minister that we have will jump on any bandwagon, and I wonder if there's an element of Downing Street trying to create a good cop and paint the Treasury and brief against the Treasury as a bad cop, and hence the release of these documents. I mean, the Treasury have definitely missed a trick in terms of the creation of green jobs, and you know, we ought to be at the forefront. My friend Dick Winchester, who writes on energy in the Northeast, would tell you in great detail about where we're missing the boat, where we're missing the opportunities, where the Norwegians and the Danes are well ahead of us and other countries are well ahead of us. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. We've talked a lot about the just transition, but the skills that exist in the northeast of Scotland for subsea engineering ought to be transferable into offshore wind, tidal and wave energy, and the engineering that exists ought to as well. So there are opportunities to grasp, but in history, I don't think there is much evidence of Tories leading constructive reform to anything ever. So I really fear for COP26 just being a talking shop where our jolly Prime Minister will inarticulately laugh off and make silly jokes. Whether he uses the Kermit the Frog as a green example yet again or not, I would doubt, because that seemed to blow up in his face. But I'm very sceptical. I think probably the Scottish Government can step forward with strategies, not necessarily with spending commitments, because obviously the budget is limited, but there needs to be a good, strong strategy and a well thought through strategy using well-tested and well-tried engineering that we have to improve job prospects, to improve wealth. I mean, we'll come on to climate change, but I mean, I also think with the increase in gas prices that we've seen, massive increase in gas prices, and the concerns about the economy, that the nuclear industry are beginning to rattle their sabre to create more nuclear fission. But we'll come on to that probably in one of the other topics later in the programme.
But yes, Kenny, it's a good point that you make, and as you're speaking there about the apparent enthusiasm for new nuclear power as a reliable and dependable source of energy, I now, of course, am immediately reminded that tidal power in particular is the most dependable and the most powerful way of generating energy. And that whilst we have small facilities, both experimental and in production now on the West Coast, that we don't seem to be doing anything like enough to be expanding that aspect as part of a basket of green and renewable ways in which Scotland, with all of the environmental blessings that we have here, that we can offer in the generation of power and the provision of power to the rest of the UK and further afield. So I'm sure we will come back to discuss that, but we will move on to another facet of the green debate and the debate about energy and the debate about the implications for Scotland, because with especially having you both on the programme this afternoon, with us being so lucky to have you both on the programme today, I was keen to talk about the plans to turn the Flotta oil terminal in Orkney into one of the world's first large-scale green hydrogen plants. The French oil giant Total Energies is part of a consortium proposing to use offshore wind to produce hydrogen on an industrial scale at Flotta, The terminal operator Repsol Sinopec said it wanted to transition away from oil and gas towards green energy. And it's expected that if approved, the earliest it could be up and running would be 2028. They've submitted proposals to the Crown Estate, who own the foreshore, and this initiative is part of the ScotWind leasing auction, which is offering the rights to develop offshore wind projects. Now, green hydrogen involves renewable energy being used to split water into two parts, creating hydrogen. In contrast, blue hydrogen is made using gas, which is a fossil fuel, and part of the production process involves capturing the carbon that's generated as part of the splitting of the water. The Offshore Wind Power Limited has already submitted a bid to develop a 2 gigawatt offshore wind farm to the west of Orkney, which it is said could power up to 2 million homes. It could also produce energy which could then be made into hydrogen in flotta and exported both nationally and internationally. The leader of Orkney Islands Council, James Stockin, said that flotta was an ideal location for green hydrogen production, as it was surrounded by the best wind resource in Europe and lay close to major shipping lanes. So, Fiona, you're our Orcadian correspondent for today. What's the local view with regard to the announcement of these proposals, both positively and negatively, from people in Orkney?
Well, that consortium wishing to produce green hydrogen and develop a huge facility on Flotta, that's all linked to them also putting in an application for a huge wind farm to the west of Orkney out in the seas. It's in an industrial scale. And why I would be a bit concerned with that is that I was hoping that we would see community development of renewables. It's what they do in Scandinavia, and therefore the people that are looking at these wind turbines every day actually get the benefit first and foremost. And that's all to do with storage of energy, because our wind turbines often have to get turned off. I mean, there's nowhere you can go in Orkney without stepping out your door and seeing a wind turbine. And we have several wind farms, and we also have applications in for more wind farms. These are on land, and of course this consortium wants to develop one out at sea. And with all this excess electricity being produced, what they're wanting to do is use some of that electricity to convert it into hydrogen. Also, you see, hydrogen is kind of becoming the buzzword, and it's not the saviour. I mean, it has great possibilities for shipping that would have to go long distances, that kind of thing. Hydrogen powered vessels that have to travel far, but you're actually far better using electricity to power, like if you were doing your small ferries in between islands. And that is what they're actually doing in Scandinavia with these community developed renewables. So I'm a bit concerned that, again, our natural resources are being used for massive profits for other people, because the people of Orkney will still be paying the highest prices for their electricity, whether that goes ahead or not.
Thank you, Fiona. Yes, I'm reminded that the first grid-connected wind turbine in the UK was in Orkney in the 1950s, and I certainly remember that when Scottish Power started experimenting in the 1990s, that they were surprised and delighted by the amount of wind that they were finding. I think their first the pilot I'm thinking about, it was producing, I think it was 1,000% more energy than was expected when they turned it on, and then they couldn't turn it off again because it was spinning round so fast in the breeze, being in Orkney. But I'm also reminded that the people of Orkney benefited from both from the employment and from the rentals that are paid by the operators of the terminal at Flotta, in much the same way as the people of Shetland benefit from the rentals that are paid from the operators of the facilities at Sumborough and at Sumborough, and more importantly at Sullom Voe. So do you think, in terms of making sure that the local people are properly rewarded, are properly participating in these programs? And as you say, it seems particularly egregious that, as you say, every time you step out the door in Orkney, you can see a wind turbine, and yet, firstly, we pay a huge amount of money to send that energy into the grid, unlike anywhere else in Europe. And secondly, there isn't a direct or a closer correlation between the use of the land in Orkney and the benefit to the people who are living in Orkney.
Yeah, well, of course, we have an oil reserve fund that's generated from the reserves coming in from Flota, and that goes to help prop up our public services. So we do have a high level of public services. Something it's a shame Scotland itself doesn't benefit from an oil reserve fund, and that's what you would like to see being developed for renewables in Scotland is a similar thing, a green energy reserve fund, a national one. Because if we're going to be putting up all the wind turbines, using our tides and our wave power to generate electricity, we should at least, as a whole, be getting some benefit from that. So a national green reserve fund would be what I would be going for. But also, we really do need to develop our community renewables and more localised power over our energy system.
Thanks, Fiona. And Kenny, as I said before, you're in the northeast, and I'm reflecting a little bit as we talk about here developments at Flotta, which would significantly increase both the size and scale and the industrial nature of what happens at Flotta, and also the need to begin to decarbonise the offshore sector and to move to greener energy generation around our shores and offshore and on land as well. Do you think there is the prospect for a new energy boom in Scotland in the same way as we saw perhaps in the 70s? And do you think what do you think the prospects are for, as Fiona suggests, that we change the approach, and rather than the benefits and the rewards of a possible energy boom flowing to shareholders, that the benefits are properly returned to the local people and to the people of Scotland?
Well, yes, I do think there's an opportunity for the North East, and as I said before, the skill base is already here. I mean, there was a lot of transition from. I mean, it's not particularly widely known how many ships were built in Aberdeen up until the early 1970s, but many of the people involved in shipbuilding transformed into oil industry work. And some of those people who were perhaps apprentices in the early 1970s are now reaching retirement age. So we've got to consider training. I mean, the Norwegian model in the 1970s, when the oil industry first started expanding, was completely different from Scotland's, not just with the Sovereign Wealth Fund, but they had training quotas where they would allow international companies to develop things, but only on the basis that a percentage of the jobs went to people who were already living in Norway, particularly training and apprenticeships. And they developed that significantly. So the skill base in Norway, I mean, Norway exports all its gas and uses very little of it itself. So it's in a very powerful position. They're looking, as Fiona mentioned, battery operated ships. And I was listening to a professor from Greenwich University this morning dismissing the nuclear option and many other options. He was talking about dependable sources of power, and you mentioned tidal power, which has got incredible potential, particularly in a direct line from my house to Fiona's in the Pentland Firth. But the options there for community involvement are much, much stronger. And I do think we have to look at these large companies and what they're planning. I mean, I was reading an article in the Herald on Sunday this morning about the potential for peat exploitation during the 1940s and 50s in Scotland. And it wasn't taken forward mainly because the turbine they developed didn't work. Whereas in Ireland and Finland, they exploited peat, which seemed like a very good idea at the time. And I was an exponent because I used to travel to Ireland my mother was from Westmeath, right on the edge of one of the major peat bogs, which were being exploited on an industrial scale. And in those days, I thought that was a very, very good idea. Perhaps in hindsight, we've dodged a bullet. I think we don't need to be slow, but we need to be cautious and fully investigate all the options just to make sure we dodge bullets, whether it's a nuclear option, a hydrogen option. I mean, I do feel that with offshore wind farms and wind farms generally, decommissioning shouldn't be an expensive or difficult thing, although I believe some of the blades are made from materials that can't be recycled, which I'm sure with the depth of knowledge we have in our universities we could address and improve upon. But yeah, community involvement, local involvement, proper benefits. Just as an example, who is benefiting right now from these massive hikes in gas prices? And where is the community benefiting in extra tax take? There isn't any talk about that at all. We're just talking about huge hikes in gas. And it links with investigative journalism. We need to be questioning things and asking about things and finding out about things and then making decisions.
That's a very good point, Kenny, a very good point that you make. Thank you. We'll move on to our next item, which similarly has a perspective from the north, and that was that, as we know, during the week, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, addressed the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik. She talked about Scotland's links with Arctic nations and how all countries must work together to tackle the climate emergency. Other speakers at the Assembly were the Prime Minister of Iceland, the Danish Minister for Foreign Affairs and the EU Commissioner for Environment, Oceans and Fisheries. The First Minister told the Assembly that the most northerly part of Scotland is closer to the Arctic Circle than it is to London. And at the Assembly, the First Minister also engaged in a series of bilateral meetings. So, Fiona, firstly, we know that there's been increasing participation by the Scottish Government with our Scandinavian neighbours, and that this address to the Arctic Circle Assembly is a symptom of that. Do you think that we are beginning to see a redirection of our collective gaze away from the south in London and away from the west in Washington, perhaps, and returning our gaze, at least in part, to our Scandinavian neighbours and to the north?
Well, the launch of the Scottish Government's Arctic policy was actually in Stromness in the Robert Rendell building. And so Orkney and Shetland, we've always had very strong links with Arctic regions, Canada, Norway, Scandinavia, Greenland, all of these countries. The Arctic Council is incredibly interesting, and I would urge people to go on their website and find out what they're doing. They're doing a lot of work with Indigenous peoples as well, because it's very important that as trading links between Scotland and the countries of the Arctic are encouraged and open up more, that local communities are involved in this, that the importance of place in all of this and of the cultural links we have. So I'm greatly heartened to see the Scottish Government not only with an Arctic policy, but being there at the Arctic Council, even as, not as a sovereign state, unfortunately, but being very welcomed there and listening to the discussion in a lot of small countries, just as we are, and they're highly successful. And to me, this is the way forward, to look to our northern neighbours.
Thank you, Fiona. And Kenny, we know that the First Minister had a particularly busy week on the world stage. In addition to talking to the Arctic Assembly, she also gave a TED talk, although we haven't actually seen it yet. But we do know that she said that ahead of COP26, Scotland is delivering on our promise to end our contribution to climate change within a generation, putting a just transition and well-being at the centre, whilst taking the big and difficult decisions that will create a net zero, climate resilient and fairer future. Now, the First Minister's, now it's a TED talk, so that's the sort of language I would expect. However, it does strike me as being in sharp contrast to the story we discussed earlier, and the apparent mismatch between the aspirations of Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, and Kwasi Kwarteng and their respective government departments in Whitehall. Do you think that the First Minister giving a TED talk and talking to the Arctic Assembly, is that the First Minister seeking to position herself on the world stage in the run-up to COP26, or is it more about the day-to-day of diplomacy and of communication with our neighbours and of seeking to address the climate change?
I think it's a mixture of all of those things. I mean, she's very highly rated, our First Minister. She's articulate. She seems to have a full grasp of many of the issues. And I think facing towards countries who have similar issues and problems to ours, and perhaps we can look to them to solve some of our issues and problems and look to how they've dealt with it to do so. And they, in turn, maybe want to look at how we've solved our other problems that they maybe have. We've got a very strong academic tradition in Scotland with very many, I think 5 or 6 of the top 200 universities in the world in Scotland. And I think we can bring something to the party. I think Nicola Sturgeon can bring something specific to the party. I think she's well respected. Scotland has traditionally offered quite a lot to the world, both in terms of academic and innovation advances. And, I think we have to grasp that again. Going back to that Treasury paper, you just feel it's almost in a different age, that London is dragging slowly, like an anchor chain that's dragging along the bottom of the ocean, stopping things happening. And I think we've got to be dynamic, and I think we've got to be adventurous without being foolhardy.
Thanks, Kenny. And Fiona, thinking more broadly about our connections, our current connections with our Scandinavian and Arctic neighbours, it's obvious that the First Minister is very keen, understandably, to collaborate with those nations in respect of the climate emergency. But do you think that there is more that we can be collaborating collaborating with and learning from the small, independent, peaceful neighbours across the north, for example, in economic policy or social policy?
Well, in all those things, I mean, the Arctic is one of the areas that felt the effects of climate change first. And it's because the seaways are opening up there that trade is becoming more interesting. But I mean, unfortunately, there's also military aspects to that too. But yeah, having any kind of links with other countries is just wonderful. And learning from their cultures and them learning about us and different languages and products they produce and that we produce too. I mean, we have to find new markets because unfortunately we're out the EU, and these are countries that value quality, and we produce excellent food and drink. So yeah, we have to look north, continue to develop those partnerships that we've already got with these nations. And some of it is actually through our academic institutions. But also, trade delegations, cultural delegations, music is a wonderful way to exchange views with other countries. So yeah, let's just look north.
Absolutely, Fiona. Thank you. And the notion that we promote some form of a mod for the northern countries, I think that sounds like an outstanding idea. We should get into that at once. But we'll move now to our final story for this afternoon, and that relates to the beginning of the consultation on the proposed Westminster parliamentary boundary changes for Scotland. The Boundary Commission for Scotland announced the start of an 8-week public consultation on their initial proposals for the 2023 review of UK parliamentary constituencies. The Boundary Commission's proposals also recommend reducing the number of constituencies in Scotland to 57, and that's down 2 from the present number of 59. They say that constituencies must contain no less than 69,724 electors and no more than 77,062, except for the 2 protected constituencies of Nanilan and Yar and Orkney and Shetland. So firstly, Fiona, whilst Orkney and Shetland, the constituency boundaries are protected for obvious very good reasons, and so we won't be talking about boundary changes for those islands, for the Northern Isles. By the same token, the requirements and the needs for political representation and parliamentary democracy are particular in island communities and are particular in the Northern Isles. So whilst the boundaries won't be changing, what is the perspective of the success? How well is parliamentary democracy operating in the Northern Isles in your experience at the moment?
Well, if you're talking about first past the post-Westminster elections, there's your big problem for a start. And are we at all surprised that Scotland's going to lose 2 MPs, Wales 8, for goodness sake, and England increased by 10? I mean, if we thought England was dominating the UK before now, this has just sealed it. I mean, the sooner we can get Scottish independence, the better. But the Scottish parliamentary elections, because they're proportional, they're far better. So people are more engaged with those. Unfortunately, local elections, which take place next year, which are also proportional, are not well supported by the electorate. I'm afraid to say that the likes of Kirkwall, the turnout is quite low. It's higher in the other isles, in the smaller isles, but mainland it's poor. And now you've got to kind of ask why that is, because apart from a Scottish Green councillor, all our councillors are these so-called independents, which they aren't really. And some of them won't even tell you what their political views are but during an election. It's quite bizarre. And they're sort of continually elected on the will you ken his face sort of thing. We're also needing a lot more women in that place too, because Orkney Island Council is incredibly dominated by, ageing white males. And that's not representative of our society. So it's a kind of mixed bag. Westminster, first past the post, terrible. Local elections, despite being proportional representation, poor as well because the electorate are not engaged with it. But the Scottish parliamentary elections are quite good, and we, of course, were represented not just in the constituency, but with Highlands and Islands MSPs from different parties. So that's a bit better.
Thank you, Fiona. Now, Kenny, we could discuss the Scottish politics all afternoon. However, I can see that time has run away rather with us. So, on behalf of ageing white men, excuse me, I think I won't bracket you in that, but I'll give Fiona the final word for this afternoon because we're almost out of time this afternoon. And so that was our final news item for today. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of the viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, culture and current affairs. If you would like to support us, and we would really like you to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be back tomorrow at 7 with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in then. Thanks to everybody for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland today, and a very special thanks to our two very patient guests and very special guests, Fiona Grahame and Kenny Anderson. I hope that you've enjoyed your full Scottish today and that you have a very peaceful weekend.